Start out, tell me your name and your
Yes.
organization.
Yes, I'm Neri Javier Colmenares. I'm the Secretary General of the National Union of People's Lawyers. The National Union of People's Lawyers is a national association of human rights lawyers in the Philippines. Its main sort of function or mandate is to provide legal services to victims of human rights violations.
And I would imagine you keep quite busy working on that.
Yes, well, the human rights violations in the Philippines have been escalating in the last 9 years under the presidency of President Gloria Arroyo. A total of about 1,100 extrajudicial killings have taken place, and about more than 200 enforced disappearances have already also taken place. Most of these killings and disappearances happened in broad daylight in public places by suspected state security personnel. So there have been a lot of cases of these killings and disappearances, and we try to do as much in trying to curb impunity by seeing to it that the perpetrators of these crimes are prosecuted, if not convicted, for the crimes they have committed against the Filipino people. So that's a lot of work actually, because human rights lawyering is not very easy, especially in countries like the Philippines. And there had been a lot of killings against human rights lawyers too. So some of our members have also been killed. But lawyers, which is one of the main campaigns of NUPL also, have been the subject of attack in general in the country. So during the presidency of President Arroyo, about 16 judges have been killed, and about 27, as of our counting, of monitoring, 27 lawyers have also been killed. Some of them are human rights lawyers. So it's very difficult. Nobody earns in human rights lawyering, but at the same time, you are under attack. Either you die or you're constantly harassed. So there are very few human rights lawyers in the country, and with hundreds of cases. And if you include other cases we handle, such as demolition of urban poor settlers in the cities, or farmers' lands being taken away by big landlords or big corporations, it goes up to thousands, and it's very difficult. So yeah, we're glad that we can reach out with other lawyers organizations like the National Lawyers Guild, for example, to also help campaign against attacks on lawyers and judges in the Philippines, and for human rights protection in general, because that substantially helps us in our work. Not only does it help provide a bit of protection for human rights lawyers, but it brings the issue to the fore. The issue that long after President Ferdinand Marcos has gone, human rights violations and continue to exist in the Philippines. So more or less, that's how we would describe our function and the context within which we work in the Philippines.
Who are the primary perpetrators of the killings in the Philippines?
Well, you see, we've studied the circumstances, and we have witnesses from the victims' families who really say that they've identified the killers as the military members of the armed forces of the Philippines. But other than that, the circumstances of the crimes were so that the evidence point out to the military themselves. The first evidentiary factor that we notice is, before a person is killed, the military produces or publicly vilifies the person, calling the person a communist, a terrorist, or a destabilizer. That's the term of the military. a few weeks before the person was killed. They show it in public through PowerPoint presentations or through videos or through public meetings. And then the second part of the pattern that we notice is the complete impunity with which the crime was committed, as if it is committed in broad daylight, in public squares, in markets, as if the perpetrators were not afraid at all of being accosted by the authorities. The third is the complete lack of interest to investigate or prosecute on the part of government and part of the police. So much so that after 1,300 or so killings and disappearances, only one has been convicted so far. And there's been no prosecution at all in almost 90% of all these cases. So, and the fourth is the failure of the government to condemn the killings. For a long time, President Gloria Arroyo refused to condemn the killings, despite the plea of the victims or the families of the victims, for her to come out openly and just condemn the killings and promise the full force of the law against anyone arrested for these killings, but she refused. She only came out with a condemnation after the United Nations and the European Union, and in fact even the United States Senate came out with statements expressing concern over the escalation of human rights violations in the Philippines. So for many human rights lawyers and the families of the victims, the evidence point to the military, and yet there has been no conviction so far with regards to the killings. The United Nations Special Rapporteur, Philip Alston, has gone to the Philippines, and his report also points out to the military. And, but impunity reigns and impunity exists, and that is why the cycle has been unbroken in the last 8 to 9 years under President Arroyo. The military believes that, the worst thing that can happen to a country is if the powerful believes that they can commit a crime and get away with it. Because the moment that sets in, impunity reigns, because they would continue killing because no one is arrested or prosecuted. So that's another thing that I am here to raise, an issue that I'd like to raise to the American people, that to a large degree, there is a continuing military aid to a repressive armed forces in the Philippines. And I am sure not a single American taxpayer would want one taxpayer dollar to be spent on bullets or aid to an armed force that is violating human rights. So I'm sure that if only the American people and the American government, the US government, would be able to withhold this military aid in exchange for stop of these killings, then it would go a long way in protecting lives in the Philippines. So yeah, that's the the point I'd like to make for the American people here, is unknown to them, a large part of the human rights violations in the Philippines is fueled by US military aid and the continuing US support to a very repressive Philippine government.
Has the Philippine government always been repressive?
Well, repression continues to exist despite changes in the presidency in the Philippines, because repression is already ingrained in the system. Marcos held sway under martial law for a long period of time, institutionalized military control over a huge number of civilian posts, in fact. So much so that it is very difficult to eradicate it by a mere change of the president. The human rights violations have not ceased, they've continued throughout the years after Marcos. No matter the president, It sometimes go down, sometimes go up, but it remains. The orientation of the military has not been service to the Filipino people. It has always been considered the military has always been considered as a tool by the wealthy and the powerful, and of course the ruling government, to prop up the regime and to ensure that dissent is stifled. Even legitimate dissent is stifled. So we know that it's a system in itself. However, any change in foreign policy, for example, in the most powerful country in the Philippines is the United States. The Philippines has been a colony of the United States. We were a colony, a direct colony in the 1800s up to World War II. But the United States has been a very powerful economic and political power in the Philippines. And in fact, they say that no president will win a presidential election in the Philippines without the blessings of the United States. And so it is very important for us that the reforms in terms of human rights, there will be a substantial role on the part of the American people in ensuring that human rights violations in the Philippines, if it is not stopped, at least is lessened to a substantial degree because of the very strong influence of the United States in Philippine economic, political, and even cultural life. As a matter of culture, Filipinos are very pro-American, pro-US. So it's very important for us. We do not wish to underestimate the people's movement in the Philippines. And in fact, for us, liberation from human rights violations, of course, should be undertaken by the Filipino people. But in terms of solidarity support from the American public, it's very important for us that the American people knew or knows about the situation there, because whether they know about it or not, or they play a major role in the sort of destiny of the Filipino people.
Is the U.S. is the U.S. carrying out military operations in the Philippines?
Unfortunately, yes. The 1987 Constitution, which was the constitution crafted by by the new government after Marcos came into power, specifically provides that no foreign troops, bases, or facilities shall be allowed entry into the Philippines without a treaty recognized as a treaty by the other contracting party. That stems from our experience with the Philippine-U.S. military bases agreement, which is the basis for the existence of then the two largest U.S. military bases outside continental USA, which is Subic Naval Base and Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. Our experience then was very negative. First, of course, the Filipinos are afraid of being magnets to attack because of the presence of the bases. The U.S. government has a lot of enemies all over the world, and the presence of their bases there, we believe, endangers the lives of the Filipino people. Second, the bases were launching pads for attacks against other peoples in Asia. And we do not want to to be a part of a system that kills the Vietnamese people or the Korean people or the Chinese people. I mean, we don't want to be a part of that. And the presence of Subic and Clark in the Philippines make us part of that. That's why the movement against the U.S. military bases in the Philippines was very strong. The third reason was, of course, a nuclear threat. U.S. bases in the Philippines, of course, do have nuclear weapons, or at least the ships that go in or the planes that go in. have nuclear weapons. And whether it's an accident or whether it's an attack, the Filipino people has no capacity at all. No emergency procedures, no way of coping up with a nuclear contamination. That is why the struggle against the bases was also a struggle for a nuclear-free Philippines. The other reason was the social ills that the bases engendered. In the base areas, you will see thousands of prostitutes, many thousands of child prostitutes, drugs, smuggling, crime. And so those were the reasons why U.S. military bases had to go. And in fact, they went in 1992, after the expiration of the Philippine-U.S. military bases agreement. And the Constitution provides that any new entry of foreign troops in the country must be by a treaty. However, the United States felt probably the vacuum of a military forward position in Asia or in Southeast Asia with the loss of Subic and Clark. That is why the Philippine government and the U.S. government together managed to skirt the constitutional prohibition by having what is called the Visiting Forces Agreement, which is an executive agreement, the main function, ostensibly the main function of which is for American troops to visit the Philippines and, train soldiers, but just visit for, I mean, it's not defined in the agreement, but the generic definition of a visit is a temporary thing. However, it was found out, what we've been saying for a long time now, for a number of years, we've been saying that there is permanent presence of U.S. troops in the Philippines, was openly admitted through a New York Times article last April, when a story erupted with an interview of a colonel and the statement of the U.S. Secretary of Defense, who admitted that in fact there had been U.S. troops in the Philippines for 7 years now, and there was also an admission of their involvement in combat. We are against the deployment of U.S. troops in the Philippines, especially if they are involved in combat operations with the various rebel groups in the country. The main reason for us is we are afraid that it will escalate. Presence of U.S. troops in the country involved in combat operations can lead to the killings, of course, of soldiers, U.S. soldiers. And in fact, it was reported just more than a week ago that 2 U.S. Marines were killed in the Philippines. And we are afraid that once U.S. troops are involved or killed in the infight, in a firefight, it can escalate because, of course, you expect the natural response of the U.S. government is to send in more troops to go after the perpetrators of the killings, of the death of the U.S. Marines. And the killings could continue. We do not want to be another Iraq. We do not want to be another Afghanistan. And I'm sure the American people would not want another Iraq or another Afghanistan in Asia. We had one of the bloodiest wars in the 19th century. The Philippine-American War cost about 600,000 Filipino lives at the turn of the century after the Spanish left the Philippines. And we don't want a repeat of that. So we believe that any effort to stop or to cease the presence of U.S. troops in the Philippines is very important, not only in terms of human rights protection, but also in terms of peace process. We've always aspired for peace in the Philippines. I have always been a peace advocate since my student days, other than being a human rights advocate. And many Filipinos have yearned for peace for a long time. And for us, the presence of U.S. troops endangered the peace process in itself because it fuels the war. So for us, the other reason, other than our fear of an escalation, is that it is also a threat to a dream of a nation, of a people, for peace. So we would really hope that the American people will be able to convince the American government to stop the continuing deployment of U.S. troops in the Philippines.
So how did you initially become an activist? How did you get involved?
Well, it's a long story, but anyway, I was born in a country, in a province which is very feudal. Huge tracts of land owned by landed few, and peasants working day in, day out. And because of the economic conditions, I became aware of rights. And Marcos came in, became a dictator, and I got to hear of human rights violations. And I don't know, I probably got, I probably felt that, you know, no person should be allowed to violate the rights of others. So I became a human rights activist then. And I've continued being that ever since. Well, I've experienced human rights violations too. I mean, I was arrested during Marcos. I think, I was a young 17-year-old then, I think. I was involved in student activism. And the military didn't like people who criticized them for human rights violations. So I was arrested. I was tortured. I think they tortured me for like, I don't know, forgot now, 5 to 7 days. There were many of us tortured. I was the youngest to be arrested in that group of political prisoners arrested during a period. So they said I was tortured the less, but still, it was torture. They would, box you, physically slap you, put bullets in your fingers, and then it's very painful if they crush it. They would electrocute you here at the nape. They would burn you with cigarettes, all this stuff. One of the, but in torture, after a few days of torture, your body begins to adjust. Your level of tolerance probably increases. I don't know. You just become numb, and it doesn't seem to so painful after that. So what really makes it more difficult is the mental torture that they do. And one of the things I experienced was the Russian roulette, they say. It's a torture where you have a revolver, and then they get all the bullets and they just put one bullet and then return the chamber and said, I remember that night, they took me at 2 in the morning, and this military man placed the gun inside my mouth. And he said, he spoke in English actually. He said, "Do you feel lucky tonight, Neri?" And then he pulled the trigger. And so you really feel your brain splattered in the wall, and you thought the bullet was fired because it would be loud because the barrel of the gun is inside your mouth, and you thought it exploded. And of course I was drained after that. But he did it twice. He said, "Oh, you're very lucky. Let's see if you're lucky again." So he did it twice. These things actually are more debilitating than the physical torture, because it sticks to your mind for years. So yeah, those are the kinds of torture. And to think that I was the least of all tortured. When they say, "Oh, you were young, in fact you're lucky, you're the least of those tortured." But what one thing that I noticed was that I was informed later that these torture methods were learned in a sophisticated manner by the military. And they don't, the military there is not normally sophisticated in torturing people, um, but they perfected the art of torture. The other thing I noticed, we noticed, many political prisoners notice, is the similarity of tortures by the military in the Philippines and in Latin America. So it is as if there is a common denominator among the tortures, both in Asia and Latin America. And so it would not be a surprise, if some of us believe that the training came from the United States, which is probably the common denominator in both countries anyway. I mean, in the Philippines and in El Salvador and in Nicaragua. So I was one of the 10,000 human rights victims who filed a case against Marcos, and we won the case in the U.S. District Court of Hawaii, which declared Marcos guilty of human rights violations and awarded us $1.2 billion, one of the largest, if not the largest, award ever in an Alien Tort Claim Act action. Unfortunately, the compensation has not yet been given to the many of the 10,000 victims, and many of them are dead or dying. I'm luckier because I was arrested at the age of 18. So at least by now I'm not that old. But old people tortured, if you were in your 30s at the time of Marcos, you'd probably be dead by now. So despite the judgment of the district court, many of the victims still remain uncompensated for the torture. But that, in a way, made me continue being a human rights advocate, because the concern and the issue of human rights is an unfinished business. It has remained an unfinished business in the Philippines for a long time. And not just me, but many of us who were human rights advocates then continue to be human rights advocates now. And that is another reason why I became a human rights lawyer, probably. Because I've always believed that there is a role for human rights lawyers in the midst of human rights violations. So that's why I persisted, continued to be a human rights advocate until now.
Have you noticed any improvement in U.S. and Philippine relations since Obama came into power?
Well, one of the things we noticed was when Obama came into power was that the Philippine president, for a period of time, was not invited by the U.S. government. And President Arroyo was very, very frustrated. She, in fact, went, I think, 3 times abroad with the hope of meeting President Obama, but failed to meet him. We don't know if that was intentional or if it is just a mere accident. But the issue of the Visiting Forces Agreement came to the fore last year when a U.S. soldier was charged and later on convicted with rape of a Filipina. Corporal Daniel Smith was convicted by a Philippine court. Unfortunately, the Visiting Forces Agreement provided that custody of the U.S. soldier will remain with with the U.S. government upon their request. That created a lot of tension in the Philippines. It was really totally unacceptable and humiliating for a nation to have not just a person suspected, but a person convicted for such a heinous crime as rape, to be imprisoned in the U.S. military, in the U.S. embassy if you call the US Embassy a prison. That is not only unjust discrimination, because all other rape convicts languish in Philippine jail, but also a sense of humiliation for the Filipino government to agree to such an agreement. And so the calls for the abrogation of the Visiting Forces Agreement became a major controversy with many people, many peace advocates, human rights advocates, or ordinary individuals who just think that justice is justice, began to call for it. And in fact, the issue is still very much alive now when the US Marines were killed on suspected combat operations in Mindanao. It was during these controversies, these heightened calls for the abrogation and termination of the US-Philippine Visiting Forces Agreement, that President Obama allowed President President Gloria Arroyo, an audience through phone. And we don't know what transpired there. And then they met. Of course, she visited the President of the United States here in the US. We don't know what they talked about, but we hope there was no commitment extracted by the President of the United States from the President of the Philippines for the continued deployment of US troops in the Philippines. The election of President Obama was one of the most highly watched event in the Philippines. I know of many people who didn't sleep till 4 in the morning to even just watch the victory and the inauguration. So, President Obama is probably the most well-known president in the Philippines now, more well-known than Bush or any other previous president. And we just hope that he would realize the implications of the continuing military presence of the United States in the Philippines and do something to implement his promise of a change that the Filipino people certainly need, and that is the cessation of the traditional deployment of US military troops in the Philippines. Whether that will be done by President Obama or not, we do not know. But I believe that an expression of concern, if not outrage, from the American people would play a major role in convincing the US government to stop that deployment. As a people's lawyer in the Philippines, my trust and my hope has always been in the people. And even if I discuss things with American legislators or State Department representatives, we, the Filipino people, pin our hopes actually more on the action and advocacy on the part of the American public. We continue to believe in that because in our experience, that is really what really works, the active participation from the people. And of course, we care, in a sense, what the American government says, what the American government does. But we care more about what the American people think and what the American people do. For us, that is the most important thing in any effort for change in foreign policy, for change in even in economic policies and in the Philippines, and for any change in terms of human rights in what used to be the only direct colony of the United States. In its history, I presume, the Philippines. So